Namo Buddhaya, Namo Dhammai, Namo Sanghai. Jai Bhim to all and welcome to the Navayana Buddhist Sangha short dialogue. Recently, we had uploaded the video on the Four Noble Truths, and we got from the Babasat perspective, and we got the comment from our Buddhist friend that they want to know the fundamental teaching of the Buddha about the Four Noble Truths. And we have with us Venerable Professor Bodhi, and I request him that please reflect on how exactly the Shakyamuni, the Buddha, perceives the Four Noble Truths and how this helps from the generation to the Buddhist community to begin to walk on the Buddhist path. Please, sir.
Okay, thank you so much, Sujit. I think it's a very important question that has been raised in the light of some of our own Buddhist friends seeking clarification when they were listening to one of our videos. For us, it's very important to note that, as we have stated in the last video, that if you were to try to understand Baba Saheb's perspective and why he was so wary about the Four Noble Truths, we have come to an understanding that it's not that he was against the Four Noble Truths. It's just that the way the Four Noble Truths are being produced as a narrative, as constituting the fundamental core teachings of the Buddha. And Baba Saheb was a little bit wary about positioning the Four Noble Truths as the fundamental core of Buddhism. Because for Baba Saheb, what is at the very core of Buddhism is Nibbana, a taste of freedom, a taste of the freedom of mind, a taste of social emancipation. This was the real message of the Buddha. So in the light of the request made by our friends, it's important to kind of just reflect a little bit, because dukkha and the way the dukkha is being related, narrativized and explained in the suttas. There are so many suttas that deals with dukkha. There's the Dukkhata Sutta in the Samyukta Nikaya, and there are many in the Samyukta Nikaya that basically kind of brings forth, the teachings of the Buddha around this notion of the dukkha. Now, dukkha as a word has multiple interpretations. This notion of suffering as being equated to dukkha has come to stick. And when people use the word dukkha, they generally refer to as suffering, at least in the English language. But even in the English language, there are multiple interpretations. Dukkha sometimes has been interpreted as disturbance, as irritation, as dejection, as worry, as anxiety, as anxiousness, as fear, dread, even vulnerability, pain. So dukkha has multiple ways in which people interpret it. But the only thing that has to be understood is that it has come to stick with this notion of suffering. But it has multiple dimensions. Dukkha cannot be reduced merely to the word suffering. It is a state of being in which people begin to experience layers and layers of pain, or lamentation, grief, and distress, and sorrow, and fear. And this whole idea of what we called a sense of unsatisfactoriness, disturbance all the time. If you were to go to the suttas of the Buddha himself, Sakyamuni would have stated a number of these. And fundamental is generally what is spoken about as in the Sutta Samyukta Nikaya, that says that if you have to understand dukkha, the very roots of this dukkha is rooted in what is generally called past, the present, and the future. And the sutta that explains that says that birth is dukkha, aging is dukkha, death is dukkha. This, if you trace the source of how this dukkha arises, how this disturbance arises, how this pain arises, if you trace all of these processes and goes to the roots, you will find in Shakyamuni's teaching, rooted around this idea of birth, aging, and death. Also in Pali called Jati, Jara, Marana. Now, why is it important for each of us, especially Buddhists, to understand this? For non-Buddhists, when you use the word noble truths or the Four Noble Truths, generally they identify Buddhism with the Four Noble Truths. Like I have many of my friends who are non-Buddhists, who when the minute you speak about Buddhism, they'll say, oh, okay, the Four Noble Truths, the no truths of suffering, and so on and so forth. But in Buddhism, and as practitioners and followers of Sakyamuni, we know that the Four Noble Truths only come to be to a state of being awakened to the Four Noble Truths after you have understood the Patiksha Samuppada. Because it is the 12 links of dependent origination that provides and unravels what is called dukkha, lamentation, grief, sorrow, pain, distress, and so on and so forth. And until unless you begin to understand the Patiksha Samuppada, you will not understand what is the layer in which this dukkha begins to arise. From a Patiksha Samuppada perspective, it is only the 10th, 11th, and the 12th conditions that are dependent on each other. Buddha taught 12 links of dependent origination. So you have to go right to the very source, which is what we call avijja. It is when you understand avijja as the fundamental source, then you'll understand jati, jara. Now, avijja is just in the context of the Patiksha Samuppada, in the light of the dukkha, is generally translated as ignorance or ignore. You are not aware of that this is happening inside you. In the language of psychology, they call it the unconscious. There is something called the unconscious that is happening that you are not aware. And that unconscious is constantly in a state of turmoil, manifesting itself in various ways in terms of words, actions, and deeds. Some people don't even know even why they're doing what they're doing. Not aware and awakened that there is the unconscious, the state of ignorance of what is called the turmoil that is taking place at the sense reality that manifests itself in dukkha. So for Buddhists, those who have gone deep into these processes will begin to explain dukkha from a Patiksha Samuppada perspective. Now the Buddha also in a few suttas explained that this dukkha, although the source is birth, aging, and death, the other processes that shapes dukkha or gives rise to dukkha is also of something called the clinging to the khandas. The clinging to something called form, sensation, perception, fabrication, and consciousness. Now, these 5 words, which is generally in Pali called khandas, this is generally what is identified in Buddhism as the self. What is the self in the Buddhism? The self is constituted by form, by sensation, by perception, by fabrication, and by consciousness. That is the self. And Sakyamuni tells us in some of his suttas that human beings have the tendency to cling to this as though it is going to be permanent forever, not realizing that neither is form permanent, neither is sensation permanent, neither is perception permanent, neither is fabrication permanent, and neither is conscious permanent. They're always in a state of anicca, moving. But in our inability to understand, we cling to it as though it's going to last forever. And when it starts moving, then we are not able to kind of be at ease with that movement. And this is generally what is understood also as the source of dukkha. Now, to explain all of this, Sakyamuni simply gave the 4 noble truths, which is the truth of dukkha, the truth of the origin of dukkha, the truth of the cessation of dukkha, and the way to the cessation of the dukkha. These 4 are generally called the 4 noble truths. And in Pali, we call it the Cattari, Ariya, Sakka. Now, what is interesting to understand about Sakyamuni's 4 noble truths is that he not only stated the process in which dukkha is, originate, succeeds, and the way out, but in that particular process, he gave us a methodology. He gave us a method, how to identify. And generally this in Buddhism, it's spoken as The first noble truth is to be able to comprehend, to identify, to recognize, to accept that there is suffering. Many of us are not able to accept that there is suffering. We run away from suffering. Sakyamuni says you have first to comprehend what is this suffering. The second thing he says, you have to seek the origin of that suffering. Because unless you seek the origin of the suffering, you unravel and unpack the suffering. Where did it come from? What is the source of that suffering? There is no way you can begin to engage with it. But the minute you have unpacked and unravel what this suffering and its origin is, then you can engage with this suffering. You can experience the suffering. You can look this suffering in the eye. And it is in that particular process, Sakyamuni says, cessation begins to take place. And the minute this takes place, he gave us what is called the middle way, the noble eightfold path, the beautiful path, in which we can actually come out of this suffering. So what is important for us when we think about the Four Noble Truths is not merely the truths of dukkha, the origin, cessation, and the way out of it, but the method that is embedded in how we, human beings, should begin to engage with this process. Now, it is a fact that if you look at the suttas, many of these suttas go back, as I said, to the 2-3 fundamental suttas of birth, aging, and death, and the clinging to the aggregates or the clinging to the khandas. But I think this is a very narrow parochial way of looking at dukkha. If you look at realities across the world, and the realities here that we experience in this country, there are layers and layers in which dukkha is generated. And for me, Sakyamuni, when he was teaching, he was responding to these layers and layers of dukkha that he was observing taking place in his reality. There is another type of dukkha, which is to do with human mind, generally referred to as the crisis of mind. People who have gone through the crisis of mind and who have experienced deep, severe depression will understand what I'm saying. When the mind, which you till yesterday was under your control, when the mind is doing exactly what you want it to do, then there is no problem at all. But the day you get up and you realize the mind has taken control over you, it is not doing what you want it to do. It has gone on its own path, and it's creating all kinds of tensions and all kinds of fear, and you have no control over that mind anymore. It's like you have lost your mind. The fear and the pain and the suffering that you go through at this particular juncture is another level. The immediate manifests as depression, and many people suffer depression. Many people suffer depression because they can't live with their mind anymore. They have lost their mind. So there is another layer of suffering that arises because of crisis of mind. Okay, but at the roots, the Buddha says, lies this birth, aging, and death, and the clinging to form, the attachment we have to form, sensation, perception, fabrication, and consciousness. But at the level of the mind, which people begin to live in the social world, we have this kind of a crisis. Now we can go deep into the crisis of mind, but I don't think that in today's discussion, there's enough time to engage with this process. But probably in another video, we can engage with what is this crisis of mind and how does Buddhism look at the crisis of mind. Now, dukkha cannot only be reduced to that kind of way of thinking, because there is also something called social dukkha. A dukkha that is generated, a fear, a pain, a grief, a distress, a sadness that is generated because of the social reality you live in. The social pain that is generated by discrimination, by humiliation, by poverty, and the fear that people face when you are poor, the fear that people face and the indignities and the humiliation that is experienced and the discrimination that they face creates tremendous, not only a state of tension, but a state of unease, a state of grief and sorrow. Social suffering, suffering that arises from social processes and social pain is something that has to be experienced to be understood. Not only that, there is also structural structural pain, suffering arising out of structural pain. When people and communities begin to experience oppression, exclusion, marginalization, rigid structures in which violence is perpetuated on people just because we belong to a particular reality. And the fear that people who are discriminated, who are oppressed, who are marginalized feel during these times is a fear that can only be, again, experienced to be understood. And there are also historical pain that generates historical hurt, where communities and realities, for instance, experience what is generally called a tremendous historical hurt, having to carry the burden of 1,000 years of history of oppression. That history is so heavy to carry. Everybody just wants to be a normal human, but historical hurt and historical pain is sometimes so heavy to carry that it creates tremendous, it sucks your energy, it takes the life out of you. And not only that, there is also epistemological pain perpetuated by epistemic violence, where communities are being invisibilized, where communities are experiencing what you call a sense of non-existent. I don't exist. The suffering that I go through is not recognized by anybody. I just have to suffer it on my own. Now, I don't have to explain more, because in India we experience these processes. When you tell someone that you're experiencing epistemic pain, people say you're lying. You're not telling the truth. But no one can understand that person who's going through that epistemic struggle, that epistemic violence, that epistemic suffering that one is going through. And then we also have existential issues, suffering that is generated by the fact that we exist. It can be an accident. It can be something to do with the environment. It can be an earthquake. Anything can happen, and life is so unpredictable. Any of these kind of processes can shape, and your life can just go haywire the next day. So the point that I want to make is that when we think about dukkha, we should not reduce the teachings of Sakyamuni only to a particular, in a very reductionistic manner, only to mean a particular small parochial thing. Sakyamuni's message was for the totality of the understanding of dukkha. It would be too small a process to reduce Sakyamuni to explain only one small thing. He lived in a particular context where he was responding to multiple realities, multiple dimensions of dukkha. And it is in that context that we must begin to understand the teachings of the Four Noble Truths. Buddhism itself is a process philosophy, an overarching meta-philosophy, a meta-narrative that helps explain the totality. Buddhism is not a parochial, reductionistic, small things here and there. It looks at the totality of these processes. So what is important to kind of note today is just to say that when we think about the Four Noble Truths, these are one of the ways of looking, especially from an Ambedkarite perspective. It's very important to probably look at suffering and dukkha from this particular perspective. Now, the best thing about the Four Noble Truths in the way Sakyamuni has kind of formulated is also to say this, that no matter what suffering you go through, no matter what concrete condition of suffering you're in, Sakyamuni says in number 4, the Four Noble Truths, there is a way out. You can come out of it. Don't lose hope. There is a way to come out of this suffering, no matter the suffering, whether it's to do with your birth, your aging and your death, your clinging to fetters, your crisis of mind, your social suffering, structural suffering, your historical suffering, your epistemic suffering, even your existential suffering. There is a way out. And he gave the way out, which I think is very important. So his message was clear. Don't lose hope. When everything is closed, there is still something called the beautiful path, the middle path by which you can come out of these processes. So what we need to leave with when we're thinking about the Four Noble Truths is that Sakyamuni himself laid this particular framework, as he said, in order to taste Nibbana. That is, I think, very important. But more than the taste of Nibbana, this path that Sakyamuni gave is a very self-respecting path. It's a path in which you have to do it yourself. You don't have to believe and submit to any god. For Sakyamuni, even if you're suffering, you don't have to go to any god and you have to submit to any god. Instead, you just have to be your own light. Atta Dvipa Bhava. It is in that particular kind of a location and that kind of a perspective in which your suffering, social suffering, existential suffering, you can come out of it. So I guess this is probably what we can think about at this point in time. There are many ways of thinking, and I think it's unfair for us to kind of, try to reduce again the way of thinking in a particular manner. But what we have tried is to open up how we should think about the Four Noble Truths, and how exactly we should proceed in the thinking process on this line. So with these words, Sujit, thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you so much, sir, for this in-depth insight about the Four Noble Truths. And thank you all for watching this video. We will come back to another interesting concept of Buddhism through Navayana Buddhist Sangha short dialogue. Thank you. Jai Bhim. Namo Buddhaya.